What are neurons, right? I mentioned to you that neurons are brain cells. Now, every cell has its own structure, has its own functioning, but there are some commonalities. So, neurons are nerve cells in the brain. They serve as the building block for the nervous system. And each neuron has the capacity to receive, process, and transmit messages to other neurons. Now, because it's a brain cell, we typically use the motor neuron as the example of what a neuron looks like. And one of the reasons why we use a motor neuron is because the parts are nice and spread out and visually appealing. You could see under a microscope the various elements of it. However, neurons have different shapes. So if you were to look at pyramidal cells or chandelier cells, these are different types of neurons, not motor neuron, and they look different. And obviously, I'm not focusing on that point because this is an introduction to psychology course, and you could take a whole semester on biological psychology. But I want you to understand that just because we're going to talk about a motor neuron, there are other types of neurons in the brain. So the classic components of a neuron are the dendrite, soma, axon, and terminal button. All right. These are your four major pieces of a neuron. And I want you to think of a neuron similar to an email system or email server, right? And for an email system to work properly, you have to have the ability to receive a message from other people. You have to have the ability to send a message to other people. You have to have a process to get rid of unwanted messages, right? And then you have the server. The server has to function properly. Now, hold on to that list of things because as we talk about it, it will make a little bit more sense. So the first component of a neuron is the dendrites. Now, the dendrites are analogous to your inbox, right? That's where how you receive a message from another cell. The soma is the server itself. Now, the server itself is how you process the information. So the soma or cell body is responsible for processing the inputs and the outputs. If there is an important message, it will process it and then pass that message to the next neuron. Now, as I mentioned, there's an electrical and chemical process. So we say it's an electrochemical process. Within the neuron, it's electrical. Between the neurons, it's chemical. So the soma plays a critical role. Now, it also has the nucleus of the cell, and that has your DNA and all of those critical components of cell functioning. So the soma plays an important part. The axon, if we're keeping this analogy going, the axon is your outbox or your sent mail. So if the soma determines that there's an important message to transmit because you had an action potential, it's going to send the message out to other neurons. Now, what's interesting is that different neurons have differing levels of something called myelin. And myelin is a fatty covering that covers the axon or parts of the axon. And depending on the amount of myelination you have, that is going to affect the functioning of the cell, the speed of impulse, and so forth. And at the end of the axon, we have something called the terminal button. And the terminal button holds your neurotransmitters. If we're going to keep this analogy of an email system going, your neurotransmitters are the actual emails that you send and receive, right? So these chemical messengers are the actual emails, right? So in the brain. Now, these chemicals have to be released into a gap between neurons, and I'll explain that shortly, called a synapse, right? Because we don't have a purely connected system. There's a gap between one cell and the next in the brain. So we have to have a way of transmitting a message between that. So we release these neurotransmitters or these chemicals into the synapse, and that's how we share the message to the next neuron, right? So that's how we send our email. And that neurotransmitter, that chemical, is going to bind to the next neuron. So it's going to bind typically to the dendrites of the next neuron, and it's going to be in that neuron's inbox, so to speak. And then it's going to continue this process until the message gets where it needs to go. So let's take a look at this. And I know I mentioned that this is more of a cartoon-esque version of the neuron. The motor neuron doesn't look exactly like this, but this is a more stylistic version. Now, if I were to go through everything I said previously, take a look at this picture. You see these branches? These branches are your dendrites. The dendrites, as I mentioned, are responsible for receiving input from another cell. After you receive input from another cell, it's going to travel to the soma, which is at the center of the cell. That's the cell body. I mentioned that there was the nucleus. You see the circle in the middle, and the nucleolus, which is the darker part here. That is the processing center of the cell. Hence why I refer to it as the email server. And then branch coming out. This is called an axon. Now, the axon, as I mentioned, is responsible for sending an impulse from one neuron to the next. So this is analogous to the outbox. And then I said there were this fatty structure that covers the axon. You see this? It almost looks like bubbles on it. That's not by accident. These almost looking like bubble wrap covering is what we call myelin. Now, it's not continuous. I said it's on different parts of the neuron because you'll see that you see these lines in between. These are what we call nodes of Ranvier. It's not continuous, the myelin. There are little spaces in between parts of the myelin which allow the regeneration of the impulse and to allow it to travel to the terminal button, right? So now, getting to the terminal button, you see these bulb-like structures over here? They're almost like round at the end. Well, this is where you have your neurotransmitters and chemicals, right? So these are the elements. Every neuron will have these elements, right? Now, what it looks like, maybe it won't look like this particular neuron. Maybe if you're looking at pyramidal cell, the cell body might look different than a motor neuron. Or a chandelier cell, the dendrites and the axons will look different, but the components should remain fairly identical. Now, I talked to you about myelination. myelin serves three functions. One, it speeds up an impulse, right? So because when you have a myelinated axon, there are parts that are covered. The impulse where we propagate the electrical piece only can get through at the nodes, which is going to speed up conduction. And the best way to describe it is it's a difference between a Ford Focus and a Lamborghini. A Ford Focus, which would be analogous to an unmyelinated axon, might go comfortably at around 60 miles an hour. But a myelinated axon goes about 220 miles per hour. Now, most people are averaging 5 to 6 feet, right? Even tall people might be about 7 feet. So no neuron is traveling actual miles, which means that a message can get from the body to the brain or from the brain to the body in a millisecond, a thousandth of a second, which is faster than you can even blink your eye. And that's why a lot of the neurological functioning seems automatic, because the impulse moves so quickly you don't even notice it. So one thing that myelin does is it speeds up conduction. It speeds up the message going from one neuron to the end of the axon and the chemical being released. A second piece is that myelination serves as a protective covering, right? So it's almost like a cast around a broken arm. Sometimes neurons become damaged and they need to regenerate. They need to modify themselves. So this protective covering allows the regeneration and quote unquote healing process of a neuron. And lastly, I mentioned to you within the neuron, we're dealing with electrical impulses. Has anyone ever had the situation where you left your lights on in your car and your battery died, and then you're flagging someone down to give you a jump, right, to restart your car? What do? They attach jumper cables to their battery, and then they attach it to your battery and allow that the current to pass and recharge your battery. But that's not the point. The point that I'm highlighting is, have you ever accidentally had, once the cables are connected to the car, the other side touch? What happens when the jumper cables touch? Anyone have a sense?
Sparks.
You get sparks, right? Because we're dealing with current or electricity, you're going to have sparks fly when these two sides of the jumper cables touch. Well, neurons have electrical properties. So there is current flowing within a neuron. So similar to jumper cables, where sparks can fly, if you don't have myelination, which serves as insulation, it's possible to short circuit the neurons. Now, here's my electrical cord, right? It is plugged. I took it out of my computer, but it is plugged in to an electrical socket. Why am I not getting electrocuted? It's the plastic covering on the outside. So similar to that, myelin is operating as a protective covering, which allows sparks not to fly, allows us not to short circuit one neuron. Now, I showed you in the previous video as well that there on the axon, it looks like little bubbles going down, but there were lines in between. There are gaps in between one part of myelin and the next. And I mentioned that this is referred to as nodes of Ranvier, right? And what that does is it allows sodium to enter the cell and increase conduction, right? So you might hear this referred to as saltatory conduction, which allows an impulse to jump or move faster from one part of the neuron to another. So that's nodes of Ranvier. Joseph.
Yes, when there's nerve damage, is it because of the myelin? Like, is it always because of that, or is it like
No,
other factors?
good question. Love it. It is not always a myelination issue. Uh, a good example of when it is a myelination issue is with multiple sclerosis. If you were to do some imaging of neurons with a person who is diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, you would see that there is a demyelination process at play. It results in lesions in the brain and spinal cord. And imagine that a neuron was supposed to be myelinated, right? Which means that it's relying on the regeneration at certain points. And it's supposed to go with a certain speed, but the myelination breaks down. What is that going to do to that impulse? Remember myelination and speed? It's going to either slow down the impulse or ultimately stop the impulse, which means you ask yourself, well, why is it that some people with multiple sclerosis lose functioning, sometimes in their arms and their legs? The answer is the demyelination. The impulse may not have gotten to the periphery as it was supposed to, right? That's one answer based on myelination. There are others, but I love the question because no, not everything is based on myelination. You could also have um, apoptosis, which is cell death. Now that's programmed cell death, but you could also have non-programmed cell death, and the cell as a whole dies out. So biology is certainly more complicated than just the myelination, but it's a good question. Now, if you want some additional terminology, when we talk about an impulse that goes from the periphery to the brain and spinal cord, we refer to that as an afferent or a sensory neuron. So a sensory neuron comes from the body and then goes from the periphery or the body to the brain and spinal cord. Whereas a motor neuron, the origin is the brain and spinal cord, and then it sends a message out to the peripheries. So that's an efferent. So think of E for exiting. So if you use efferent E, exiting, that'll help you understand that it's an output. Now, both sensory and motor neurons are going from one place to another. They're traveling at a distance. Whereas we also have something called an interneuron. Now, interneurons are not projection neurons. They're fairly localized neurons, and they serve as a bridge between sensory and motor neurons, right? And combined, we have what's called a reflex arc when we have an interplay between a sensory neuron, interneuron, and motor neuron, right? It's almost like an arc. Because keep in mind, we need messages going both to and from the brain at all times. So we're constantly going to be using this input, output, and relatively localized neurons to communicate. Even as I am lecturing now, you actually have sensory neurons activated. In your inner ear, you have what's called hair cells. and the sound is going to cause these hair cells, which are a form of neurons, to be activated, and it sends an impulse to the brain. And it's going to send an impulse to your auditory cortex. And as I'm lecturing, this happens without you even thinking about it, right? It just goes naturally. And once you hear what I am saying, you might take notes. Well, then you have a message going from the motor cortex to your arm and your hand to allow you to write your notes. So something as simple as this lecture, you have your sensory, motor, and interneurons activated. Questions on that? All right. So we also have to understand that there are two processes when it comes to neurons: an electrical process and a chemical process. The electrical process is what happens within the neuron. The chemical process is what happens between the neurons. And I'm going to break down each of these elements separately so you appreciate it. Now, what allows the impulse to go in one direction? Well, we have something called the law of forward conductance, which allows neurons to move in one way, right? So it moves from dendrite soma to axon and out. It doesn't have a reverberating circuit going backwards. That would confuse the neuron, so to speak. Now, between neurons, the chemical process, we can send back channel chemicals to the previous neuron and say, hey, stop firing, right? There is a process of communicating between neurons that does go backwards. But within a neuron, the impulse goes dendrite soma, axon. All right, so let me pause the recording there. The next thing we're going to talk about are action potentials, right? So let me start it again.